Okay, everyone, we're just a few minutes away from getting started here. Checking to make sure that everyone available to get on. We're also on Facebook, on our HSP Parish Facebook site, if you'd like to join in there. And then, of course, again, we're part of the HSP Parish website, and that's our mainstream is coming into there, and that we're glad that you could join us this evening. And we'll be talking about Revelations, and to do that, we will be looking at Daniel tonight. Actually, we're going to do history tonight. We'll talk about that here in just a few moments. So we will first let everybody else catch up. I will not be able to see your chats on the parish site. For some reason, we've been logged out, but if you have questions, just jot them down, and you can text them to me or email them to me, whatever you would like to do. And then hopefully next week we'll be logged in. I don't know why we're not, but that happens sometimes. So, all right, it is the top of the hour. So again, we thank you for joining us tonight for our first Bible study of 2025. And again, had a lot of requests to take a look at Revelations, the last book of the Bible. But to do that, we've got to talk history, and we've got to talk the book of Daniel. And so that's kind of where our focus is tonight, are those two things. And let's see here. We're going to do kind of a summary of the book of Daniel, and then we're going to do that. Okay, so also if you want to chat or you have a question in chat, you can send it. Tyrell is able to send it to me. For some reason, like I said, I can't get into it tonight, but we'll get that fixed. But it's the first time of the year. You know how those things are. So, all right, so this is the study of the book of Revelation. And Revelation is a book full of symbolism and imagery, okay? And it was written in a style of writing we call apocalyptic. The word apocalypse comes from the Greek word that means an uncovering, okay? The apocalyptic literary style was used by Old Testament prophets when they would prophesy concerning world events. For example, anytime they would prophesy the fall of a nation or a great disaster or God's judgment, they would write it in an apocalyptic style. And so we see this style throughout some of the prophets, and also, of course, through the book of Revelations. There's John, who wrote the book of Revelations. He used a lot of apocalyptic writing in his book. And he did it that way because they were being persecuted by, of course, the Roman Empire. And so he used this style of writing in order to keep the Romans from understanding its true message. And if you were not Jewish, if you had no knowledge of the Old Testament or Hebrew symbolism, you would not discern the true meaning behind the images and the symbols that John was using in the book of Revelations. And a lot of us are in that similar circumstance today. So in order to understand Revelation, we need to review some Old Testament material where many of these images and references are found. There's over 400 references, but no direct quotes in the Old Testament. So we need to examine some of the Jewish symbolism to get the message behind the images. And much of the information we need comes from the book of Daniel, although Ezekiel does contain some of the same images. And so, anytime we need to study the book of Revelation, we begin with an understanding of Daniel. Therefore, we will begin with Daniel, and then we'll move to the book of Revelations after we are finished. So in the next few weeks, we're going to focus on Daniel. So let's talk about history. All right. If you like history, you're going to love this next section. If not, just hang in there because it'll all start to make sense. Joshua led the Israelites into the land of Canaan, which became Israel, in approximately 1410 BC, before Christ, okay? And for the next 300 years, they conquered the nations living there, and they established themselves. Now in 1060 BC, Saul became their first king of a united Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel were united, and their nation was one. And then, of course, in 1020 BC came King David. David, who became famous for taking down the giant, so Goliath. And so then David, he became king. He subdued the entire land. And then he extended the borders of the kingdom from the Egyptian desert to the south of the Euphrates River in the north, from the Mediterranean Sea in the west to the desert in the east. Okay, so King David came in, took over some more territory, and at that point in time, Israel was very, very big. Then in 980 BC, Solomon became king, and for 40 years, Israel enjoys a golden period of peace and prosperity, during which the temple was built in Jerusalem. So this is quite unique because we know Israel has not had many times where they've not been in war. 40 years of peace and prosperity. Now, King Solomon dies, and it was at that time, 940 BC, before Christ, that the northern kingdom was made up of 10 tribes, and then the southern kingdom was made up of 2 tribes with its capital in Jerusalem. And the two were never reunited, and they competed for dominance in the region. And after the split, there was a decline in moral and religious fervor in both kingdoms, of high and low fidelity to the Lord, followed up on one of another. So both of them split, and then the Israelites started fighting against each other in a way. There was difference in morals, difference in religion. And during Israel's development from 1400 BC to its divided kingdom in the 9th century, the Assyrians came about, and their nation dominated the world scene politically and militarily. And their capital was to the north in Nineveh, and the Jews often had to pay tribute or fight off this strong and wicked neighbor. Well, in 722 BC, the Assyrians attacked and destroyed the northern kingdom and scattered the people throughout other nations and brought many into exile into Assyria. They also brought foreigners to live in the north and mix with the remaining Jewish people. And the result was that the northern kingdom's population was mixed with foreign nations, so it was no longer a pure Jewish blood and heritage nation. These mixed Jews were eventually called Samaritans by the southern kingdom and despised because of their mixed blood, their mixed religion, and their collaboration with enemies against the south in times of war. Meanwhile, on the world stage, a new power emerged to challenge the Assyrian supremacy, and in 612 BC, the Babylonians destroyed Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, and established themselves as world rulers. Now, in 606 BC, the Babylonian army, led by future king Nebuchadnezzar, captured Jerusalem, carried off the main leaders, noble, and royalty to Babylon, where they began 70 years of captivity, which was the subject of prophecies made by Jeremiah 20 years before the fact. Among the leaders and young nobles carried off at this time was a young man named Daniel. Now you understand why all that history means something here. And so Daniel was part of that, and he would grow in importance and prestige in King Nebuchadnezzar's court because of his ability to interpret dreams and prophesize. Also taken away at this time was Ezekiel, who also was a prophet. Now, so why was Daniel, why was Ezekiel, why were these people taken? Well, God allowed his people to be taken away into exile, but then he provided for their spiritual needs. And Daniel in the palace was influencing the king with his special gifts. Ezekiel lived among the people and ministered to them with his teachings and his prophecies. So you might say that God placed the two of them in those positions so that God's word could continue to be spread. So 20 years later, in 586 BC, after the king who had been left in charge of the southern kingdom by the Babylonians rebelled, the Babylonians returned to Jerusalem, destroyed the temple and the city, and carried off even more Jewish people into captivity. The Babylonian system was to carry off the leaders and retrain them in the Babylonian culture, religion, politics, and then return those people to their homelands to rule under their administration. In 539 BC, the Medes conquered the Babylonians, and the new world leader was a man named Cyrus. He became king in 536 BC, and in that same period, the king released the Jewish people to return to their homeland and provided them with help to begin rebuilding the temple and the city. It was during this time that Daniel died while in captivity in Babylon, and from about 500 to 332 BC, this group shared the world power with another mighty nation, which was Persia. It is during the reign of the Persian kings that the city of Jerusalem was completed, the temple was rebuilt, Ezra reestablished the law, Malachi prophesied to the people who had resettled in Jerusalem, and Nehemiah returned to rebuild the Great Wall around the temple. Now, Old Testament history ends in 400 BC with the work of the prophet Malachi. There are two other historic events that take place that have great significance for the world and also for the coming of Jesus Christ and the spread of the gospel. Alexander the Great, he conquers the Persian nation in 331 BC, and Greece becomes the new world power. Alexander dies soon after in Babylon with a broken heart because there were no other nations to conquer. And in 146 BC, Rome destroys Carthage and puts an end to Greek dominance. And of course, by the time we know that Jesus comes to be, Rome is the new world power for the next 500 years. So it is important to understand that there's a story within a story going on here. There is the story of the Jews, their kingdom being destroyed by foreign armies, their people being carried off, and two of their people, Ezekiel and Daniel, writing about their experience in the Old Testament. And then there's the story of world kingdoms. Through the Bible accounts of the experiences of the Jews, we can trace the rise and fall of 5 world powers, which historical records confirm: the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. And now, why is that so important? Because much of Daniel's visions, his dream interpretations, and prophecy will chronicle the rise and fall of these world powers and the eventual coming of the Christian age at its proper point in history. Exact historical prophecy that can be verified through history books, and that's one of the strongest proofs for the inspiration of the Scripture. People doubt the Bible. Read Daniel, read Ezekiel, and read your history books, and you'll see that they all tie in. In 605 BC, Daniel begins to predict the rise and fall of 4 world powers into the next 600 years. And that's why the language, the symbols, and the prophecy are directly related to the meaning interpretation of the book of Revelation. So, how do we study the book of Revelation? we study the book of Daniel because of its history, its prophecy, its language, and the images that relate directly to the features of the book of Revelation. So, how do we summarize this part of this? We think about this. Chapter 1 of Daniel is an introduction to the entire book. Now, chapters 2 to 6 describe Daniel, his three companions, and the experiences they encounter in Babylon. And then chapters 7 to 12 narrate visions that Daniel has concerning world powers and their relationship to the kingdom of God. So we're going to look at a real quick summary, not the entire chapters, in chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the book of Daniel. So we're looking at a way, in a sense, that we're understanding all this background, the imagery, the symbolism that is contained in the book of Revelation, and we're going to find a lot of this in Daniel, because both Daniel and Revelation speak to a primary audience, and that is those who believe, as well as address issues on the world stage, especially the Roman persecution, the Babylonian persecution, the Persians, the Greeks. Daniel was a young man. He was a young man from a well-to-do family in Jerusalem. He was carried off in captivity by the newest world power at that time, Babylon, and their great king, Nebuchadnezzar. Babylon was the greatest city and empire in the pre-Christian era. The Assyrians had been booted out, but their cities were not as great or beautiful. Babylon was ruled for most of its time by Nebuchadnezzar. 45 years in all, he was their king. And he was never tired of beautifying and improving his capital city. And I think some of you know the history of Babylon. Ancient historians say that the walls around the city were 60 miles long, 15 miles on each side. The walls were 300 feet high, 80 feet thick, and 35 feet into the ground. So enemies could not tunnel under that. All were made of brick. There was a quarter mile of cleared space around the wall where a moat was built. There were 250 towers, 100 gates, and sentries posted everywhere. The city of Babylon, nobody could get into. The city itself was divided by the Euphrates River that flowed through it, and there were drawbridges to get across. There were 53 temples and 180 altars to a goddess, and the goddess' name was Ishtar, which was the goddess of war and love. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's palace alone was huge, walls of 50 feet thick, and he also built one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. I'm sure some of you have heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. He built these for his queen. The gardens were 400 square-foot platforms held up by arches that cascaded down one from another. They were filled with flowers, trees, and shrubs, and were all watered from a reservoir at the top, fed by, yes, hydraulic pumps from the Euphrates River from below. Underneath the arches were luxurious apartments, the pleasure grounds of the palace, and they were built while Daniel was the chief governor of the wise men of Babylon. Both Isaiah and Jeremiah prophesied that the great city would not only be destroyed, but it would remain uninhabited forever. Well, in 539, Cyrus, who had taken over Persia, led his army into Babylon and captured this seemingly indestructible city and nation without even going in to a long, protracted battle. What they did was they diverted the flow of the Euphrates River, and when it dried up, they marched the army under the wall along the dry riverbed at night, capturing the Babylonian leaders by surprise. It remained an important city throughout the reign of the Persian kings and even to the reign of Alexander the Great. But after his death, the shift of power went to Rome, and the city of Babylon declined. And by the time of Jesus, it was mostly in ruins. And except for archaeological expeditions, it is still abandoned today. just like the prophets had said it would. And it was into this city, this empire, that Daniel and several of his friends were brought for retraining and re-education by the king Nebuchadnezzar. So the book of Daniel presents the man Daniel as its author. It was confirmed as Daniel's work by Jesus himself in Matthew. You can write this down, Matthew 24, verse 15. It was also accepted by Jews and early Christians, and this view was unanimous. Again, Matthew 24, 15, Jesus himself confirms Daniel's work. The book is written in two languages, Chaldean or Aramaic, which was the diplomatic language of that era, and the Hebrew language for the balance of the book. And this is what might be expected from a book written for Jews living in Babylon, containing information describing their actual experience in Babylon and references to their own Jewish past and future. Daniel was of a noble family, as we talked about. He rose to a position under King Nebuchadnezzar, and this is how this happened, okay? So we're going to be in the book of Daniel, chapter 1, and again, this is just a summary. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave the Judah king into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Then the king ordered the chief of his officials to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom there was no defect, who were good-looking, who were showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom. They were very smart, they were very knowledgeable, and they had the ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered them that they be taught the literature and the language. And the king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. Now among them, from the sons of Judah, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them, and to Daniel he assigned the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now, God showed Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials, and the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you will make me forfeit my head to the king. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and he kept giving them vegetables and water. As for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. Then at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the conjurers who were all in his kingdom. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. So that's Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 21. So now that, in a compact first chapter, Daniel summarizes the reason why he and the 3 others in the palace are in there. Part of their training was to immerse themselves into Babylonian culture, and that included eating their food. But they accepted and excelled at the academic training, but refused to eat the food because they felt the food was sacrificed to idols. They were not prepared in kosher style, and it seemed unclean, so they did not want to eat it. And of course, their test of faith results in the Lord's blessing them so that they maintained their right to eat without violating their conscience, and they succeeded in impressing the king and securing very high positions in the palace. Okay, now we're going to do a quick summary. This will be our last thing we do in our Bible study tonight, is a quick summary of Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 through 49. This chapter describes the beginning of Daniel's ministry of prophecy in the king's court. And what takes place is the following. The king has an unusual dream that makes him anxious since he does not understand it. The Babylonians were adept in the black arts, the occult, and magic. They would try to foretell the future by reading the stars, or, yes, sadly, even cutting open animals and reading their inner organs. They also put much importance in dreams and their meaning. So the king calls his wise men, a collection of sorcerers, astrologers, counselors, and ministers, to give him the interpretation of the dream. Now the catch is that he does not tell them what the dream is. Think about that. So he calls all of his wise men together, which includes Daniel and all his 3 friends there. And he says, I need you to interpret my dream, but the catch is I'm not going to tell you what the dream is. They must tell him the dream, and they must interpret it. And he tells them that if no one can do this, they will all be executed and their homes destroyed. And this included Daniel and his 3 friends who were part of the court's advisors. The wise men confess that they cannot, and so the king orders the decree that all the wise men are to be executed. Now when Daniel hears this, he and the 3 other Jewish youths go to God in prayer, and God reveals the dream and its interpretation to them. And then Daniel goes to the king with his revelation. He saves himself and all the others. So good job by Daniel, right? So here's our reading from the 2nd chapter of Daniel, starting at verse 31. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue, and that statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until the stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay, and it crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time, and it became like sand from the summer, and it just blew away. So there was not a trace of it to be found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. And Daniel said, now we will tell its interpretation. You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand, and has caused you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. After you there will arise another kingdom, inferior to you, then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. Then there will be a fourth kingdom, as strong as iron, and inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. In that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron. It will be a divided kingdom, but will have in its toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. As the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong, part of it will be brittle. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay. They will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it itself will endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. So Daniel not only discovers the king's mind, but also prophesizes the world events that we talked about that are going to happen in the next 650 years of Daniel's time. The great statue, the head is of gold, the breast of silver, as well as arms, and all of that embodies the kingdom of Babylon, the first great and magnificent world kingdom. And the breast and the arms of silver represent the dual nature of the Persian Empire that conquers and replaces the Babylonians. Silver coinage and this people's wealth in silver fits the imagery in the dream as well. And then the belly and hips of brass refer to Alexander the Great and the Greek nation, who will become the next world power after the Persians. And then the Roman Empire is described as legs of iron with feet of mixed clay and iron. The Romans introduced iron weapons in warfare. At the beginning, they were tough and unbreakable, but as the empire grew, it began making alliances with other nations. And then, of course, the stone cut without hands refers to a kind of a supernatural source. The small stone totally destroys the statue and conquers its essence and substance. And of course, that stone is the kingdom established by God, never to be destroyed and always alive and growing. And it'll eventually dominate everything and last forever. And what's so interesting about this is when King Nebuchadnezzar hears this, he falls on his face to honor Daniel as a true prophet, and he worships Daniel's God. Nebuchadnezzar becomes a Christian right then and there. He also makes Daniel the head of all the wise men and counselors in the palace, and his three friends the administrators of the province of Babylon. This is a tremendous prophecy because of its clarity and exactness. He said this dream was about the future rulers of the world. He gives the exact number there will be as well as their order and enough information from the dream to identify them. He prophesies correctly about the coming of the church and at what exact period of time, the Roman, when Jesus appears, and it would appear and destroy the opposition and continue its growth. He even correctly interprets the idea that none of these kingdoms would ever revive, and they never did. Jesus, the apostles, and the last over 2,000 years have confirmed that the church, the kingdom of God on earth, the stone cut without hands, continues to grow, filling the earth long after these other kingdoms have dried up and blown away. So this section is important not only to prove the inspiration of the Bible, but also to set the scene for what will take place in the book of Revelation. In Revelation, continues the prophecy originally made in Daniel, but completed in the time period when John writes the book of Revelation. And that's where we are tonight. I hope you enjoyed this part, and I look forward as we look at some of the other chapters. I think next week we'll look and summarize more of the book of Daniel, and we'll break it up again into those portions of the book, probably chapter 3 through 6 next week, and try to break that down before we look at the last part of Daniel, and then we jump into Revelation. Again, I hope you enjoyed our time this evening. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. Of course, you may be able to see this at any time throughout. It's going to be here for you to watch whenever. You can watch them one right after another as we continue to go down. So again, thank you again. We'll be back again. We'll have our in-person Bible study at the Paxton United Methodist Church Wednesday mornings, 9 o'clock Mountain, 10 o'clock Central Time, and then, of course, right here on our HSP Parish website, and also over on Facebook, and that will be at 6 o'clock Mountain Time, 7 o'clock Central Time, every Wednesday night. We're going to do it through the whole month of May. June, there'll be a few interruptions as I have to attend some conferences and stuff, but we'll just keep on going as long as we can. And this will take us a while. It's going to take some time to go through the book of Daniel and the book of Revelations. God's blessings to you all. May God be with all of you. May God lift you up. For those of you who are suffering, may God heal you or at least comfort you. May God continue to show his love, grace, and forgiveness to us all. In Jesus' name.